Hi, my name is William Henderson.
And I'm B. McGraw.
And this is the Unjerked podcast. So the Unjerked podcast is semi-affiliated with B. McGraw's website, which is
the Journal of Astrological Big Data Ecology, or JABD.com.
Today we are going to talk about carbon emissions, what we actually need to do to reduce CO2 emissions. So let's get started. So as far as carbon emissions go, I think I'm trying to think of the best approach to kind of look at this topic. I don't want this to be a lecture about climate change and why you're bad for not believing in it. I think I believe in climate change. I think the science points in that direction, but I don't think we would successfully create a podcast that changes people's minds on that.
Unlikely. People have been trying for years.
So instead, I'm going to try to find sort of a common ground that might get people on the same page about the end solution, or rather what we need to do to fix our common solution. So the argument I'd like to make for people who are climate skeptics is that there's a strong national security argument for moving away from fossil fuels. When you look at where does all the oil and gas and coal reside in our world, there's different ways of measuring it. There's total proven reserves, which is like how much of the material actually exists underground. And then there's, the capacity you have to extract it, and other things of that nature. And for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on proven reserves. So if you go to the OPEC website, OPEC talks about, how much of the world's oil that they have. As far as proven reserves go, they control 80% of all the proven reserves in the world, which is substantial. And when you look at what percent of those are Middle Eastern countries, 67% of OPEC is Middle Eastern countries. So 67% of 80% is something on the order of about half of the world's oil. I don't want to do all the math right now, but it's roughly 50% of the world's oil is in the Middle East. And what that does is it makes the Middle East an extremely strategically important part of the region. And it would be great if we didn't have to worry as much about what's happening in the Middle East. But the reality is there's a massive amount of oil there. Even if we do produce, because the U.S. does produce more oil than any other country in the world, I believe, largely because of, fracking and things like that. But the way oil works is it's a global commodity. And so prices are reflected by the global supply and demand of oil. And so And the mechanism through which that happens is, let's say oil is cheaper in the U.S. than it is in other countries. Well, then a bunch of people are going to, basically put a bunch of oil on shipping containers, container ships, and basically take that oil to another country and sell it. Basically arbitrage. And you can't really stop that. It's just too difficult to stop that. And so practically speaking, even if we produce a ton of oil, if OPEC decides to reduce supply, it's going to increase our oil prices, even though most U.S. oil does not very little U.S. oil actually comes from the Middle East. Most of it is generated in the U.S., a lot of it in Canada, etc. But because it's a global commodity, the prices still are affected by what happens in the Middle East.
They can produce more oil and drop down the prices, and now our oil production is no longer profitable, correct?
Could you say that again?
So the link between Middle Eastern oil and U.S. domestic oil is that the OPEC countries can just produce a ton of oil to drop the price down and make our oil production no longer profitable.
Yeah, and I think especially Saudi Arabia, I think, has the lowest cost of production of oil, because the cost to produce oil depends on a lot of things. How accessible is the oil, and how far do you have to drill? How much do you pay the people who drill the oil, et cetera? And so there's a different cost depending on the region. I think Saudi Arabia has by far the cheapest cost of production, and that gives you a lot of leverage as a country, because you basically have the ability to lower prices to the point where you're still making money, other countries still are not. And so that's another factor you have to consider. And oil is essentially, so oil and gas are both, they're fossil fuel. So basically you had these marine life that basically settled on the ocean floor and got compacted over the years. And because of the pressures, they basically turned into oil and natural gas. And so oil and natural gas come from the same place, are generated through the same basic mechanism. I think there's slight differences in like pressure and things like that, which lead to, gas being formed versus oil being formed. But I believe usually the same areas of the world you see oil are the same places you see natural gas. Coal is a different story because coal does not come from marine sea life. Coal comes from marine sea life is redundant. Marine life. And I'm not talking about like whales. I'm talking about like plankton and stuff like that, small microorganisms. Coal comes from peat, basically. You have peat bogs. You have bogs that have, all this plant life in it, and then it dies and is anaerobically, basically in an anaerobic state because it's underwater or whatever. Because bogs and swamps have a lot of water. And so when you look at like peat, like in Ireland and Scotland, there's a ton of peat, and peat can actually be used for fuel. And then if peat is compressed for millions of years, it turns into coal. So coal is actually oftentimes geographically found in different locations compared to oil and gas. And so you actually don't see a lot of coal, comparatively speaking. But moving over to natural gas, so, Russia has by far the most natural gas in the world. I believe their proven reserves are something like 24, like a quarter of all the proven reserves in the world. And then the Middle East is something like a third of all the natural gas as well. So even when it comes to natural gas, they're in very strategically, places that are volatile or perhaps not friendly to the United States.
Have we tried nation building or spreading democracy?
We've tried. So
do they not like democracy?
I guess not. Not.
That's a shame.
So coal is a different story when you're looking at where coal is located. 24% of it is in the U.S. And then after that, it's Russia, Australia, China, India, et cetera, et cetera. So there's not a ton of coal in the Middle East. There's a ton of coal in the U.S. There's issues around, how good coal is for the environment. It's basically the worst fossil fuel that exists. Less of a national security environment, or there's less of a national security argument for coal compared to the others. The issue, too, is there's different use cases for the different fossil fuels. So you can't use coal for driving vehicles because vehicles need a liquid of some kind to work, and coal is a solid. And so you can't run a car on coal. But
that's because you haven't read my steampunk novel.
I guess I haven't considered that yet. But, on the other hand, oil is heavily used in vehicles in the form of different fuels. But, there's not a lot of oil power plants. There's some, but there's not a ton of oil power plants. So with power plants, it was usually mostly gas and coal, and then oil was more for vehicles. So those are a few of the differences. I think another big argument that you have to consider is, we're running out of these fuels. So according to current projections, there's about 50 years remaining of oil, assuming we continue at current production and current consumption, rather. There's 50 years of oil remaining, 200 years of uranium, 86 years of natural gas, 435 years of coal. So there's still more coal. There's still a lot of coal. There's a lot of uranium. There's not a lot of natural gas, 86 years. That's that number. So the coal number is US only. Natural gas number is also US only. But I'm assuming because of you're scaling both supply and demand, the numbers are probably roughly equivalent on a global scale. The uranium number is global, I believe. And then the oil number is global. So 50 years, and there's always the possibility of discovering new oil reserves somewhere. But just the natural way the economics work is that, generally speaking, new oil deposits tend to be more difficult and more expensive to extract from. That's just kind of the basic economics. Is you start with the low-hanging fruit and then move on from there. And so the more additional incremental discoveries, more likely than not, they will be more expensive to extract from. So this shows that Again, this argument does not apply as much to coal, but for natural gas and oil, like we're just going to run out of it. It's just going to happen. And would you rather panic and freak out and not have a plan in place when that happens, or would you rather be ready when that happens? I would prefer the latter. In the oil issue, I mean, hypothetically, that could happen in our lifetimes, you know. Of course, the reality is, like, as the date approaches, demand will be higher than supply, and so prices will go up. And so hypothetically, you know, it could reach a point where like you never really run out of oil. It just no longer becomes economically practical. But as a practical rule, our current trajectory is going to run out within half a century.
It's not like you can just overnight change the layout of a city or your life to suddenly not use oil. And likewise, say you have an entire agricultural industrial base that runs off of oil and coal, you can't quite change that overnight.
Yeah, and also like I think a big thing we're going to talk about is just how much our current lifestyle only really works with fossil fuels. And so something we're going to talk about is like what changes do we have to make to get to where we want to go. Let's go over some of the circle jerk arguments. So first, I'm going to go over a couple that I kind of thought up of, and then you can talk about some of the ones that you looked into. So one thing, I think a thing I don't really like a lot about a lot of climate activism is that, you know, essentially there's a lot of the blame game. You know, they're like, how dare you? You're destroying our generation's future. You know, you're not doing enough. And that doesn't answer the question, like, what is the thing that you're not doing enough of? Like, okay, like what's the thing that we should be doing? I think the blame game kind of doesn't really fix the problem, you know? So I just don't like it because it's a non-actionable argument, I suppose. The other similar thing is kind of the just stop oil perspective. I'm not talking specifically about those UK activists, but in general, just saying like, hey, just shut down all the oil, shut down all fossil fuel plants, or even just like stop making new ones. And the reason I think this is not effective is because if you don't have a plan in place to transition that energy, prices are going to rise. And then, you know, this is not even hypothetical. What happened when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and prices went up? What happened? You know, countries started going back to fossil fuels immediately. Yep. You know, and so the general public, there's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if your basis needs aren't being met, if your cost of living is going up dramatically, people will demand a fix to that. And the short-term fix to that is going back to fossil fuels. So that's not ideal. The other argument I don't like is I mean, it's a half correct argument. It is kind of like saying, you know, it's all the oil companies' fault. And, you know, there is this article from Scientific American that talks about how ExxonMobil knew about, at the time it was Exxon, but they knew about climate change as far back as the 70s. And I've heard of some other research saying that this has happened even earlier. And so, yes, like a lot of those companies knew about this problem and didn't do anything about it, or they tried to cover it up.
But on top of it was the oil company's fault, and it's similar to the government's not doing enough. It's not really solution focused. It's just complaining.
Yeah, and also like, you know, and some people are like, oh, throw them in prison or fine them a ton of money or shut them down. It's okay. I mean, that's not going to fix the problem. So that's why, you know, and also like there's a supply side and a demand side to any market. And I think it's almost like think of them as like drug dealers. You know, you can throw all the drug dealers in jail. They're going to keep coming back because there's a demand for the drugs. Why is there demand for drugs? It's because of, you know, general issues with lack of community and unhappiness and lack of fulfillment that people have. And so the real solution to fixing drug problems is to fix the societal problems that cause people to need drugs or to demand drugs. And so, you know, we live in a society where the lifestyle requires the use of fossil fuels. So what are some of the other things that people have been saying?
Well, if I can read off of the list we compiled there. I mean, a lot of it, might kind of go back to the government's not doing enough critique, as in if if we just, one big argument is if we fix our emissions in our country, whatever other country is just not going to do it, and then it's not going to matter because someone else will be polluting and using up all the fossil fuels. On top of that, it's not just our country versus another country. A lot of people be like, well, why am I going to change my life and my behavior when, so-and-so rich person is still going to be doing all of their, private jet flying. There's tons of memes out there right now making fun of Taylor Swift and her private jet. I mean, she's not the only person with a private jet, but she seems to be the current target there. So it's kind of why should I change my behavior if someone else is just going to do it way worse? It doesn't seem worth it to the individual to change their behavior or consumption habits. One other argument that I've heard is that this also disadvantages third world countries because, everyone else, Europe, America, a lot of Asia at this point, we all had the chance to develop and create infrastructure with fossil fuels. So now the underdeveloped countries that haven't really been able to modernize like we have, they're going to be behind forever if they don't get to use fossil fuels like we did. And then on top of that, a lot of people say like the damage is already done. And this is like if you are making an argument just on climate change and not we're going to run out. The damages are so bad that we might as well just like learn how to live with climate change than it would be to change our behaviors, because it's just so much work to change the entire world's lifestyle. I mean, we're going to have this whole podcast here on every part of our life and how it's connected to fossil fuels and everything that we have to change to not use fossil fuels, and that's just so much work. Why don't we just adjust how we live on the coast and everything else that we need to do to just adapt to a warmer climate? Another popular one that I hear is most of the solutions involve whatever rare earth minerals and materials, and that we're just pushing our problems somewhere else.
So the sort of the whataboutism arguments about, well, if we stop and other countries do it, or like, hey, if Taylor Swift is flying in her jet, I mean, you could say that about anything. You could say, for any social problem, you could say like, well, other people will do it too, so what's the point? I do agree, go ahead.
I think those arguments kind of do loop back to the government's not doing enough, because I think that that's always going to be there unless governments, both local, national, and international, actually start legislating and enforcing changes to use more renewable resources and cutting emissions. Otherwise, there's always going to be someone that's not going to follow those rules.
Right. I just think in general, whataboutism could be used for any, like, you could say like, well, why can't I like litter? Why can't I just throw trash out my window if other people are going to? I mean, I just don't find it a compelling argument. I do agree, and one single individual changing their behavior is not going to change much. I doubt that collectively voluntary changes themselves will really work because of just the collective action problem. I do think it's a good way to set an example. You could say, hey, this is what things will look like if we want to get to where we want to get. And so I'll do it individually and at the same time push for changes. As far as the third world countries not having a chance to develop, I honestly agree with that a lot. I think the solution is to provide, when you look at the actual cumulative carbon emissions, overwhelmingly they're from, the US, Europe, former Soviet Union, China, etc. And so tons of like most of Africa and Latin America, like they did not contribute that much to the problem. So the anger is reasonable. I think the solution is to be like, hey, we will subsidize energy transition in your countries too. In addition to, I mean, I would do it in our own countries first, just because of, putting putting the oxygen mask on yourself first type thing. But like, I think that's a fair, because it's a form of reparations, I suppose. I'm not a fan of like directly giving cash to countries as climate reparations, because I mean, let's be honest, a lot of that cash is not going to be used in the right ways. But if we're like, hey, our version of climate if they're like, hey, we messed up the atmosphere, so we will use our own money to help build clean energy in your country. From a philosophical perspective, I think that makes sense. As far as like things are bad anyways, I mean, things can always get worse. I mean, it's like, do you want, X million people to die or twice as many people to die? Do you want X million people to be displaced or twice as many or 3 times as many? So
it's just, it's going to take so much work and lifestyle changes that it's not that it's like already so bad, but the amount of effort that humanity is going to have to do to fix it is just so daunting that people are like, I don't want. It's like a huge task that you just keep procrastinating on. So I definitely understand the psychology of not wanting to deal with it or think about it.
Right. I guess it's not an all or nothing thing, because like the doomerism, when people say like, the destruction of our planet or extinction of our species.
Oh my gosh.
The planet's not going to get destroyed. The planet is, unless a massive thing the size of like Jupiter hits our planet and like shatters our planet, the planet's not going to get destroyed by a warmer climate. The actual collection of rocks that we call our planet's still going to be there. And all projections say climate change is not going to be an extinction level event. It'll be horrible in terms of the damage it causes to societies and migration patterns and all sorts of things. But like, it's not going to be an extinction level event. Is what the science is saying.
It is going to be incredibly disruptive just from migration alone. Like,
right.
My bet is most of the population isn't going to be that affected, but enough of the population is going to be affected enough that they have to move, and then migration almost always causes issues when one people group move to another people group, and then yada yada yada. Oh, I don't like you when they move. I mean, it happens everywhere, and people are going to lose their homes over it.
Right.
And then finally, one other argument, which I see that you linked something on, is that the negative effects of climate change are not going to outweigh the social costs of cutting emissions, because, I mean, just tackling this issue at all is not going to be good for the economy, and you're going to have to slow down. We're going to have to use less, and that's just
I don't agree with that.
It'll be harder.
I don't agree that it'll be bad for the economy. So there's a study there's a article from, I believe this is the University College London, whatever UCL is. But they basically said, there's an estimate saying by the global impact of climate change would be 37% lower annual GDP. And, there's a lot of reasons that there's a reduction in GDP. I mean, there's things like, like we mentioned before, there's migration, coastal areas flooding, and a lot of most of the economic output happens in coastal areas right now. So, and then there's, fires, heat waves, just natural disasters, etc. So it'll be substantial damage. And then we're going to go over some of the solutions. And the solutions are like, they will require adjustment, but I don't think they would cause economic catastrophe. I think they would in some ways be good for the economy. So we'll talk about that a bit. We're also going to talk about the rare earth minerals.
I hear that one a lot.
So when it comes to focusing specifically on oil, another thing to keep in mind is like not all oil becomes fuel. A lot of it turns into, plastic comes from oil, asphalt comes from oil. A lot of clothing comes from oil. When you're looking at like synthetic fabrics, those mostly come from oil. So a lot of things come from oil, but when you look at the actual numbers, most of it is fuel. So there's this University of Calgary website, and it looks at, where does it go? 43% of oil, and I believe this is by volume. 43% goes to gasoline, 23% to heating oil and diesel, 9% to kerosene, kerosene type jet fuel, 5% to Coke. I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Coke, the beverage?
Not the beverage. And then, most, a lot of it, heavy fuel oil, et cetera, et cetera. And then you do have 3% to asphalt, so not a huge number. And then 2% to petrochemical feedstock, which is materials used to create plastics and other things like that. 2% to lubricants, so industrial lubricants, and then, a couple other categories. But like most of it, we'll probably never stop using oil altogether just because there's materials we make out of oil.
Oh,
there's a lot of,
it's just so useful.
And there's a lot of use cases where like plastic, like you can't really, like for a lot of like, let's say laboratory use and stuff, there's situations where plastic containers are essential and like glass is just not a good substitute. So I think we're always going to be using oil, and perhaps there's other methods of production of like polymers and stuff, but my guess is we're always going to use some oil, but the vast majority of oil is used for fuel. So
I just can't believe that this is how I found out about the secret ingredient of Coca-Cola.
Yeah, that's why they don't tell you what the ingredient is.
Apparently it's gasoline.
It's not to protect the wonderful flavor. It's actually all gasoline. All right.
That's why it's so calorically dense.
So, and also I forgot fertilizer comes from, I believe,
that's
fertilizer.
Right.
But I don't think that's oil. I think that's from natural gas. Because I think it's natural gas. I think natural gas is methane, and I believe methane is used to produce a lot of like nitrogen-based fuels and stuff like that. So, anyways, and then who emits? There's a couple ways to look at it. If you're looking at cumulative emissions, 29% of cumulative emissions are from North America, mostly the U.S., 29% from Asia, 12.7% of total is China, and then after that it gets much smaller. Like India is only 3% cumulative, Japan 4% cumulative. The EU,
Russia's pretty
28.
That's a lot from Russia. It's 10%.
This is cumulative. I think.
I think terrible was all
I think
the way back then.
In the Soviet era, I think there's probably a decent amount of economic activity. The EU is 22%. Europe overall, if you include Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, etc., is 33%. And then Africa 3, South America 3, Oceania 1.2. So, it's a fair argument that like almost none of the cumulative emissions come from Africa or South America. That's true. When you look at who did this, it's mostly America, the EU, the former USSR, and China. That's kind of the main contributors to this. And until recently, economic activity correlated with emissions. So, that kind of explains a lot of it. The goal is to reduce the correlation, right? Yes, so are there ways to reduce the correlation? I'm not a fan of just reducing growth because, like I said, we know what it looks like to have low carbon emissions. Go to a impoverished village in sub-Saharan Africa, they emit very few emissions. But like when you look at that type of environment, there's just extreme poverty and disease.
It's a lot harder of a sell for people as well.
It is an impossible sell. People will refuse to go back to that lifestyle. And a lot of impoverishment, when people are impoverished and are looking for their next meal, they don't have the time to care about big picture problems. They don't have the time to think about things like climate change. It's like, that's not on my priority list. So I don't think that's a viable solution. When we look at annual emissions, so this is the, I guess like the annual flow rate, if you will, whereas previously we talked about the total from the past several hundred years. If you're looking at like the annual rate, right now, a big chunk of it is from China. I believe it looks like roughly a quarter of it comes from China. And then after that is the US, India are roughly 2/3 of the emissions. And then all the other countries, 100 whatever countries, are the remaining 1/3. So again, it's mostly, I think the main difference is that China is much bigger in terms of current annual emissions compared to their historical trend. India is also bigger than all of the EU in terms of current emissions. So that's notable. And, what causes emissions? So there's some interesting data here. And it's important to really understand, like, okay, when we talk about emissions, like what exactly is causing that, I think the default people go to is transportation. They just think about, cars. That's definitely part of it, but there's a lot more to it. And so a quarter of it is electricity and heat production. This is globally speaking. And this is from the EPA, city of Chicago. Well, it's the city of Chicago, but using EPA data.
Oh, that's one of the other circle jerk arguments we forgot to mention, is that if you electrify your transportation, that's just going to move your energy production somewhere else, and it'll still be emissions.
That's something. So there's actually an increased efficiency, even if you use fossil fuels for your grid energy. It's still more efficient to use electric vehicles because the internal combustion engines are just less efficient than using a giant power plant.
So even with batteries?
So like let's say you have a car, an electric car, and you hook it up to a fossil fuel based grid. Obviously it's still eventually is related to carbon emissions because the power plants are emitting CO2, but it's still more efficient. It still emits less CO2 than using an internal combustion engine, because an internal combustion engine is just less, it emits more CO2 than the same amount of energy in a power plant. So it still would be good from that perspective. There's another argument about like how much capacity can the grid handle. That's something we'll talk about. But yeah, a fourth of global energy is electricity and heat production, a fourth agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So that's, crops and livestock, deforestation. That's a lot bigger than I thought. 6% of it is buildings, with a caveat I'll mention later. 14% transportation, 21% industry, 10% other. So the biggest ones are electricity, heat production, land use, industry, and then after that transportation, and then buildings are lower after that. The one caveat to this is it doesn't it's important to actually for example, electricity use, a lot of that is eventually used in other contexts. So for example, you might use electricity that's transferred over to a building, and so when you actually adjust the numbers, it gets a little more complex. So what I mean by that is, transportation is 14% of use, and then 29%. So starting from top to bottom. So transportation is 14% of world carbon emissions, 20% in the U.S. So the U.S. is much more transportation focused. And then if electricity is distributed to end uses, it doesn't really change because there's not a lot of electric cars. Agriculture, forestry, 24% globally, 10% in the U.S., 11% if electricity is distributed to the end uses. And then here's where it starts to change. So industrial production, 21% of world emissions, 23% in the U.S., 30% in the U.S. if electricity is distributed. Essentially, when you actually distribute where, if you were like, okay, electricity is created in a power plant, but like, what's it actually used for? Then, up to a third of the built environment, which is buildings, up to a third of total emissions go to buildings. So that kind of adds some additional context that, might not be apparent initially. So when you actually look at the actual end numbers, a lot of it is related to buildings. About a third of it is related to buildings, about a third industrial production. And then, some of it.
Is that the power going to buildings primarily like actual power usage plus air conditioning?
Most energy is used for heating and air conditioning, not for lights. Sense. Not for lights or appliances. So if you go into that's where the emissions are going. So if you go into more detail, so energy use or energy mix, So electricity, roughly speaking, um, globally, a third of it is coal, 23% natural gas, 15% hydro, 9.5% nuclear, or something like 9% nuclear, 7% wind, 5% solar, 4% oil, 2% bioenergy, and less than 1%. Actually, oil is not really used a lot in actual power plants, interestingly. But it's mostly coal and gas, some hydro, some nuclear, and then wind and solar just aren't that high. When you actually look at the growth pattern of different fuels, there's, like wind is growing, if you look at this graph, but it's not growing.
Oh, that looks pretty good though.
It's
That's
decent,
steady
but,
growth.
It's all right, I suppose. The thing that is a little concerning is nuclear has been going down, and I think nuclear is not as dangerous as people think.
Yeah.
And then when you look at countries, so and in this graph, this is from Our World in Data, but it looks at fossil fuels, renewables, and it looks at nuclear as its own category. When you look at which countries use the fewest fossil fuels, it's France, Brazil, Sweden. Why is that? In the case of Brazil, they just have a ton of hydropower. They have the Amazon River. They just have a ton of rivers.
Yeah, they got a lot of rivers.
Hydropower. Sweden, has a lot of renewable, but they also have 30% nuclear, the least fossil fuels. A lot of it can be explained by high nuclear use, a lot of it by high hydro use. Hydro is geographically constrained. It only works in certain geographies, and it also has mostly been tapped. I believe about half of the global potential of hydropower is already being tapped. In the U.S., I believe almost all dammable rivers have already been dammed in the U.S. So there's some areas of the world where it can still be utilized, but for the most part, in the U.S., it's already kind of being used, essentially.
And that's the easiest option is hydroelectric.
There's still people who say, well, it causes ecological damage because the reservoir floods, a bunch of land and people get displaced. So there's no free lunch.
I mean, but it does, but shut up, man.
So when it comes to transportation sector, so according to Statista.com, I believe, I'm trying to see where the source is, but basically they're looking at what are, in transportation, what emits CO2. 48% cars and vans, 16% heavy freight, which is large trucks, 9% medium freight, which is medium trucks, 10% international shipping, which is, cargo ships, 6% international aviation, 6% bus, 5% domestic aviation, 1% rail. So the notable thing here is, something like 3/4 of all emissions come from road vehicles. So vehicles that are on the roads cause the overwhelming amount of transportation emissions. And then after that, shipping is a lot higher than I expected. It's 10%. Aviation, I think it's hard to really contextualize it. It's high, and also, it's not super high. I think though, most people don't fly. I think the average person flies only a couple times a year. So when you look at,
there are a lot of people that almost never fly.
Yeah, so it's concern. I guess if the number of people who flew increased dramatically, it became much more affordable for random people to just fly for random things, that would increase significantly. So, and it's also tricky because it's hard to electrify aircraft because it only works for really small prop planes.
Yeah,
but batteries
jets really can't work without they run off of pollution. They have to shoot the pollution backwards.
Literally.
Yeah, quite literally.
So rail is very low, and when you think about the physics of it, rail is basically you have metal on metal, and so you have metal rails with metal wheels, and the friction is just so much lower. And so, a large if you're driving a car, a large chunk, potentially most of the energy is just overcoming friction. That's what the energy is used for. So I thought that was very interesting. But roads are the biggest reason why there's emissions in that sector. Not the road itself, although the road is also made out of oil. But I'm talking things on roads.
What if we made the roads out of solar panels?
We're going to talk about that later. It's a horrible
I
idea.
saw.
Yeah. So when it comes to land use, so I found this white paper from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. They didn't go into like deforestation. They only focused on agriculture itself, but 39% of emissions are enteric fermentation, which is flatulence of livestock. And then 20% of it comes from livestock manure, and then 13% fertilizers, 10% rice cultivation, because when you flood a rice field, it kills off a lot of the plants and that causes emissions. 6% manure management, 5% burning savanna, 4% crop residues, 2% drained organic soils, non-CO2, whatever that means. So most of it comes from, animals, honestly. So the biggest way to fix that problem is to eat less meat. I'm going to be honest, I eat meat. I love meat.
Can we teach cows to have a deep sense of shame and flatulence?
I don't think that'll work.
Or
and then when we look just
they're just that impolite.
When we look at EnergyStar.gov, they talk about industrials. Where is the emissions? Where did the emissions come from? So when the industrial processes that are used to create products, that's what causes the emissions. 24% chemicals, 21% petroleum coal products, 15% primary metals, 11% non-metallic minerals, and then it goes on from there. So, when you need chemicals and metals and non-metallic minerals and food and paper. Food is kind of its own thing, but you need those materials to make things. So there's some efficiencies you can find in the processes, but a lot of it is when you have products, the production of that thing you have in your house probably emitted CO2. So that kind of sums up where they're coming from. So the end state, if we achieve a low carbon future, what does that look like? Well, we need to have dense cities with multifamily insulated homes and mostly walking or public transportation. So dense cities are important. And again, if you live on a farm, you can't do density. I understand that. But if you live in a city, it's important to have density because it makes it more viable to have public transportation. You can walk to places. Like I moved to a downtown area recently, and I only use my car once a week just because I could walk to the convenience store. I can walk to get coffee. I can walk to do X, Y, Z. And like our episode on zoning laws showed, the reason why we have low density suburbs in the US is because it is legally mandated. It's not a market outcome. It is legally mandated. And
Are you telling me the
restrictions,
government isn't doing enough?
You know what? I guess Greta Thunberg was right. But the flip side is how many climate activists talk about zoning reform?
Not enough.
The end state has to include less consumption of consumer goods. There's just no way around it. And less meat consumption as well. And again, I love eating meat, but it's hard to argue with these numbers. So my sort of sales pitch would be not stop eating meat, but just only eat meat like once a week or twice a week. Maybe.
So here's where I am hung up. And this is probably what's going to get a lot of people in the back of their mind is less consumption. This is going to be an effect on the economy, inevitably.
Yeah, I guess so. But I think there's different ways because GDP is how much people pay for things ultimately. And that's how people put a value on goods and services produced. And so, if you move to, if you reduce the amount of consumer retail goods, you can still, when you're transitioning to a low carbon future, that'll involve a lot of, building of industrial, building of new energy infrastructure. It'll involve building new process companies that have more efficient production of certain goods. And so there's also, yes, if you look just at less consumption, that would reduce economic output, but there's other things that would increase economic output. So I'm skeptical overall that this would crash the economy. I just think, when we started using Zoom calls instead of flying to business meetings, it did hurt the airlines a bit, but like the airlines are still around, and it didn't. I would consider it mostly a net positive that we don't have to fly somewhere for like a 1 hour meeting.
Yes,
I think it's a good thing.
I'm a huge fan of that.
Technically, that was lower consumption of flights. Yeah, I think there has to be less international travel. I just think it's going to be really hard to decarbonize large jumbo jets. And actually, I looked at like, is it cheaper? Is it better to use ships? It actually uses more energy to use ships, interestingly, and we can go into that. And then we just need greener energy sources and electrified transport. So that's what the end state looks like. There's a couple. Go ahead.
Can we achieve less international travel by outlawing travel blogs or making more Little Italies?
Oh man, that's a good one. I think number one would be the most effective. I think if we ban travel blogs.
This is true.
Yeah.
But I think every town at least needs a Little Italy.
That was episode 1. We're going to move over to the next episode of this series next week.
Yep, we'll see you then.